Hello, everybody. I'm Brent Fraser, Vice President of Pharmaceutical Reviews at CADTH. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking to you today from Toronto, which is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I will be moderating today's webinar on the consultation currently underway on proposed changes to CADTH's drug reimbursement review processes. Today's session is the culmination of a number of activities related to our drug review processes. As such, you may be familiar with some of this information. Many of the components were consulted on in July 2019 and presented at CADTH's information session last November. We value the feedback provided by all stakeholders and appreciate that the current environment is challenging and uncertain due to the ongoing pandemic, resource challenges, and competing priorities. We strongly encourage all stakeholders to provide feedback within the consultation period to allow us time to proceed with these changes. We hope that you will find many of the changes favorable to your submissions. We have accommodated requests from industry to gradually phase in changes to the drug review program and have removed the proposal that would require sponsors to provide a systematic literature review. We will consult on this in future. The consultation opened on June 25th, and we will be accepting feedback for 6 weeks until August the 10th. We have not changed the timelines for this consultation. So today's webinar is designed to help sponsors and stakeholders understand the proposed changes that may impact the drug submission process at CADTH. In addition to this webinar, we held a session with patients and patient groups on July the 9th to highlight specific changes that may impact their input to the submissions. Some of you may have attended that session. I'm joined today by a number of colleagues who you will be familiar with. Trevor Richter is Director of Pharmaceutical Reviews at CADTH, and he'll provide details on the proposed changes. Sarah Berglis is CADTH's Manager of Patient Engagement. She'll point out some of the key changes from a patient perspective, including new opportunities for input. Nicole Mittman is CADTH's Chief Scientist and Vice President of Evidence Standards, and she will highlight some of the areas we are looking at within our deliberative framework. While this is touched on in this consultation, a more focused consultation will take place in the future. Michelle Mujumdar is Director of Scientific Affairs, and she will talk about ethics within our reviews. And finally, Karen Lee, Director of Health Economics, will join us during the Q&A session to respond to any economic concerns within this consultation. We appreciate that the consultation document is rather lengthy, and at the end of the presentations, we will take as many questions as we can. You can submit questions or comments at any time using the chat function in the Zoom control bar. We won't be able to read aloud all of the questions and comments, but they will be visible to everybody on the webinar, and they will be included in our stakeholder feedback. Finally, I want to let you know that the webinar is being recorded and will be made available on CADTH's website with closed captioning. And I will pass it over to Trevor.
Thanks, Brent. Do you want to go to the next slide, Josie? Thanks. So I'll run through essentially the highlights of some of the changes that we're proposing to achieve alignment. Of course, a number of these are not really changes as much as borrowing pieces from each of the existing processes to come up with a unified way of doing things. But before getting to that, I just wanted to cover what we are covering in this consultation and what we're hoping to cover in the future. So Jose, if you could go to the next slide. So essentially, I think we have two phases of consultation. The first one is what we're essentially addressing today, which is a consultation that is really aimed at getting input on a proposal to essentially harmonize or align all of the key drug review processes at CADTH. Brent did mention that in looking into developing an aligned process, there were some proposals that were essentially a little bigger and potentially more contentious and more difficult to achieve in this phase of the work that we've been doing. So we've made a decision to remove those pieces and deal with them during a second phase. So those two pieces would be the deliberative framework and process and the potentially a different approach to clinical reviews. Nicole will broach the deliberative framework and process today, and we will get back to the clinical reviews at a later stage. So we can go to the next slide. So for today, we're dealing with essentially the first consultation phase, which, as Brent mentioned, was open for feedback on June 25th. A couple of weeks ago, we had a webinar, as Brent mentioned, for patient groups. It was open to really any patient groups, patients or their representatives. Today, we're having a very similar engagement with really anyone that would like to attend, but primarily aimed at sponsors and industry and consultants. As Brent mentioned, after 6 weeks, the feedback period closes on August 10th. We'll then take sufficient time, probably up to about 2 months, to review that feedback after it comes in, before hoping to launch the aligned process, ideally in Q3. That's to be confirmed depending on what we receive in terms of feedback. We can go to the next slide. As I mentioned, there will be a second phase, which we will deal with, during which we will deal with in more detail the deliberative framework proposal, as well as the approach to the clinical reviews. Just a bit more detail on why we've made that a second phase. It really was a challenge to complete that work, given the challenges raised by the ongoing pandemic. But we have made some significant progress and looking to engage not only today, but in future with you before those proposals are finalized. We'd like to make some progress on that in the fall, but recognizing that these are uncertain times, so that's TBD. So we can go to the next slide. So just to set the context and maybe review our approach to the current proposal. We can go to the next slide. Thanks, Josie. So essentially the scope of what we're discussing today, and in terms of the proposal that we've put out for consultation, it really is squarely to look at aligning our existing review processes, aligning as in terms of creating a harmonized process with a common set of procedures that would underpin all our processes related to reimbursement. So in case you're not familiar, these really are at their core the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review, or PCODR, the Common Drug Review, or CDR, newly launched Interim Process for Plasma Protein Products, plasma-related protein products, as well as our Interim Process for Cell and Gene Therapies. So our idea is to essentially provide you with an opportunity to provide feedback on a process that would essentially unify all of these individual review streams. So we can go to the next slide. So the rationale as to why, well, there are a number of compelling reasons. I've put up a few here, which are the more important ones. I think increased efficiency. We are a resource-constrained organization that is funded largely by taxpayer dollars. So increased efficiency is always top of mind for us. I think a very important point is internal and external consistency. It relates to a whole lot of potential issues for us, but suffice it to say, consistency is important in terms of equity, predictability, transparency, etc. I think though a key rationale was really to take advantage of the fact that we have in existence at least 2 well-established programs, a couple of newly established programs, each of which are slightly different and have evolved differently and really have best practices that could be borrowed to create essentially a better, stronger, more consistent, more efficient, more transparent, more equitable process through adopting essentially the best parts of the individual programs. This is essentially what underpins the proposal that we've put out. We can go to the next slide. So our approach has been really consultative. We did initially start with the idea of an internal review of the existing processes and procedures to essentially, what I said, identify the best practices in each of those. We've had discussions in developing and refining a master process which would serve as the aligned review process with internal and external stakeholders. So certainly with our funders and our key customers, but as well as with external stakeholders as well, not only with patient groups and representatives, but including with individual sponsors, consultants, and sponsor representatives such as IMC. We have, as usual, been as cognizant as possible to be proactive in communicating what our thought processes were in developing this and what the specific changes and proposals are that we're aiming to put in place. We have used our usual channels to do this, as well as Brent mentioned a few public occasions where we have put this out, this information out for everyone to be able to react to. And then we've now been able to essentially consolidate everything, wrap it all into one proposal, which is essentially the proposal that we have put out. In the end, it is as Brent mentioned, it's a fairly lengthy document in excess of 50 pages highlighting the changes that we'd like to move ahead with. But I'll cover today just some of the more important or notable ones for you. So we can go to the next slide, thanks. So I guess just before I get into highlighting some of the changes, I would like to emphasize, or just preface it, I guess, by emphasizing that very little in this proposal will be new to many of you. Many of these changes have been presented and in fact discussed in some form over the last 1 to 2 years. As Brent mentioned, we are very confident that most of these changes, the vast majority, will in fact be beneficial to you as sponsors and to other stakeholders, and particularly, I think they will be good news for anyone that's interested in a process that is more efficient, more equitable, and more transparent. So that said, I'll move on to the first thing we wanted to highlight. It's really administrative, but we've essentially consolidated all of our communications for the different review streams and the different channels through CADTH into really one single newsletter that's going to be issued weekly. And as the slide explains, it'll contain a wealth of information, most notably notices for pending submissions, calls for stakeholder input for patient groups and other stakeholders, announcements of initial recommendations being issued, as well as final recommendations, and then, of course, our regular program and patient group focused updates. So we're hoping this will reduce the burden of having to track multiple sources of information and deal with probably the high volume of email if you subscribe to all of our various channels. So a small change, but we hope that'll be well received. So we can move on. So changes to our confidentiality guidelines. We are essentially updating our guidelines. We did present this previously, in fact, last July, I believe. But really, the aim is to change the guidelines and update them to enhance transparency further, clarify some of the definitions that we use in applying our guidelines. And really, a key operational goal was to reduce the burden associated with our redaction process as it exists right now. So further details are in the proposal document that has been put out on the website. But in a nutshell, we're asking that essentially data that are not redactable and must be disclosed would be all clinical data that are used in the submission, including data and analyses and methods, etc., related to indirect comparisons that you might perform and submit. Obviously, prices remain transparent, as well as the methods and outputs of economic work, the economic models that you'll submit to us. Information that we could consider or remain considering confidential and therefore redactable would be things like proprietary market research data, market share forecasts, patient support program details, and really anything that would meet our regulator, Health Canada's definition of confidential business information, we would consider as confidential and would still redact that. We'd have to probably determine these as a case-by-case basis, but we are definitely interested in moving towards fewer redactions rather than maintaining the current heavy workload associated with all the data that is currently redacted. So we did originally start at a position that I think was more transparent, but we have since made some compromises and realized that in the interest of moving things ahead, we're happy to still entertain some information as being considered confidential and therefore will still be redacted. We can move on. So collectively, some changes under industry engagement I wanted to highlight. An important one will be that all sponsors will have an opportunity to review and comment on the draft review reports prior to the committee meeting. So this will be new for our oncology reviews. This exists right now for our non-oncology review programs, but certainly this will be new for our oncology reviews, and we're pleased to offer you an opportunity to review and provide feedback to our review teams on the draft reports. In addition, we'll offer reconsideration meetings. So those are meetings with CADTH staff for all reviews. So this will be new as well, but for all reviews, we'll be offering the opportunity to interact directly with CADTH staff on a call. Pre-submission meetings will be offered up to 12 months in advance of the filing date for all reviews. You can take advantage of those meetings. We in fact encourage everyone to take advantage of those meetings. They're not mandatory, but we find they are beneficial for everyone involved. We'll continue. We started offering teleconference as an option during the pandemic, and we have decided to continue to offer that as an option post-pandemic. And just to emphasize that we have included PCPA and the drug plans in those meetings, and this will continue as well. We hope to expand their participation at some future date, but that certainly is continuing. There will also be continued support for ad hoc meetings as needed with CADTH staff. I think one thing to note here is that because we are offering the opportunity for you to review and comment on the draft reports, we're offering meetings ad hoc as well as the reconsideration meetings and pre-submission meetings. This really makes the checkpoint meetings that were in place for the P-coder review stream essentially superfluous. So we're looking forward to remove those and instead replace them, as I said, with the engagements that we've summarized on the slide. So we can move on. Just a note about drug plan engagement so that you're aware. We are essentially strengthening and harmonizing the input we get from public drug plans that participate in the review programs at CADTH to essentially ensure that we get it for all reviews, that we get it as early as possible, which will allow us to incorporate their feedback into the review process. It will be incorporated and posted publicly so that we are being transparent with that feedback. And in addition, we will be instituting a standardized process, which is not current practice at the moment, but we will be instituting a process where drug plan input is presented and discussed individually for each review with the expert committee. And then this really speaks to a renewed commitment for us to address implementation issues that are particularly relevant to the public payers. Drug plans will also be given an opportunity for all reviews to provide formal written feedback on draft recommendations. This is currently part of the PCODER or the oncology review process, but we'll be expanding this to essentially all reviews at CADTH or in the pharmaceutical reviews program. And finally, implementation process, we are instituting an updated and harmonized process for addressing implementation questions. At its core of note is the ability for drug plans to essentially request that CADTH convene a panel of appropriate experts to deliver implementation advice for any issues that are not addressed in CADTH CADTH recommendations from expert committees. This is not essentially a new process, but it really represents a harmonization of the existing CDR process for implementation panels, as well as the modified process that we have on the oncology side, which I'll talk a bit more about later on. So we can move on. So healthcare practitioner engagement. So we've really taken some of the learnings from a lot of the work that we've done through our engagement with clinicians and healthcare practitioners, all of whom treat patients. But I think largely borrowing from the learnings from PCODER's clinician engagement process, where they had engaged with individual clinicians, to come up with a new clinical engagement strategy that will really focus on input from groups or associations of HCPs. So we've put examples up there. There are more details again in the proposal document, but really looking to apply a similar process as we do for our patient engagement to the HPC side, and look to engage formal groups like tumor groups, guideline groups, or professional associations, not limited to clinicians per se, but to healthcare practitioners, and to get their input. We're really focused on encouraging groups or associations to provide that input, as we do on the patient engagement side, simply to create a system that is sustainable, that'll reduce the administrative burden, particularly on our side. We are, as I said, we have limited resources, and thereby I think maximize the impact of these submissions. And we're pretty confident that this will be something that we can get up and running very, very quickly, and it'll be as effective as our patient engagement process currently is. As I said, it won't be restricted to clinicians, medical doctors, but will be more broadly accepting submissions, including from nurse practitioners, etc., as long as you're part of some sort of formalized group or association. So we can move on. In terms of clinician engagement, specifically regarding clinicians as healthcare practitioners that are treating patients and how we use them during our review, we just wanted to highlight some of the changes, not really changes, but just to emphasize how we're aligning how we use clinicians across our reviews, particularly for the oncology and non-oncology review streams. We'll align this to be more consistent in the way that we engage and use our experts. Just to re-emphasize how we do and how we will use experts is that all of our reviews will include at least one clinical expert. The vast majority do include more than one expert. And of course, more complex reviews include multiple experts, usually at least 3 up to 5, 6, and even in excess of 6, depending on the complexity of the file. We will continue to engage clinical experts jointly in collaboration with INES for files where this is possible. And our experts will continue to be part of the core review team. They participate throughout the review process, as well as participating directly in discussion with our expert committee. So that will all continue and be made consistent in terms of its process across our review streams. So we can go to the next slide. Just to highlight in terms of the clinical review process itself, the way that we carry out our clinical reviews, as we mentioned a couple of times now at the outset, we are looking at different ways to approach that. Right now, as part of this consultation, really no major changes to be aware of. In terms of the process, we'll continue to do an in-house systematic review of the evidence for all reviews, except of course tailored reviews. We will be developing a common review template that will be applied across all our review streams. Again, something to note is that we are still looking at different approaches to this, perhaps including what other HTA agencies do, which is request the sponsors provide the systematic review. But we will address this again in a few months' time in a second phase of consultation. And just to move on, I think, actually, we'll leave it there. We'll move on in the interest of time. So thanks, Jose. A couple of points on the economic review process. So we are proposing to bring back the ability for sponsors to submit to us a cost minimization analysis for certain submissions. I think at the top of the slide is our, a clear statement that our preferred approach, our preferred position in terms of submissions to us remains a cost utility analysis. We recognize, though, that there may be cases where the preferred approach could include a cost minimization analysis, and this really is reflecting feedback we've heard from a number of stakeholders, including yourselves, sponsors, consultants. So we're happy to be able to adapt our processes and reflect the feedback, and we're proposing, again, details in the consultation documents, but just to summarize, we are proposing that we would be amenable to accepting a CMA, cost minimization analysis, where certain criteria are met. They're summarized on the slide, but really these would be any drug or a drug where there are other options available in that class already, particularly reimbursed by public payers, and also that the new product has to demonstrate at least equal clinical efficacy compared to the other products. And then obviously we have to look at situations where it would make sense in terms of the new product providing some sort of compelling rationale in terms of being potentially cost savings, which is really speaks to the essence of the cost minimization analysis. So happy to receive feedback on that, and we hope that will be well received in terms of us being able to provide the ability for submission of CMAs for certain files. So we can move on. Thank you. In terms of the review process itself, just to recap what we have done in terms of changes already to the economics piece at CADTH. We've harmonized the review template. We have harmonized the submission requirements for you in terms of what you're required to submit to our various existing programs. For example, highlighting the alignment in terms of what the base case should be and the type of analysis, etc. So we hope that is making submissions less complicated on your end in terms of at least the submission requirements being aligned. We've aligned in terms of requiring a budget impact analysis and what that needs to look like across the programs. I think it's worth highlighting that what will be new is the fact that we'll be posting our economic reports for all CADTH reviews going forward. So this is currently the process for CDR, as you're probably aware, but not for the oncology side for PCODER. So going forward, our proposal is to not only share those, which I mentioned before, with the sponsor, but to post those publicly on our website as well. So we can move on. In terms of drug recommendations, not any major changes there. As we mentioned earlier, Nicole and her team are working on some potential updates in that regard. For this, in terms of our alignment work, we're continuing with the current recommendation framework, which, as you know, is essentially the same. Well, it is the same for our various expert committees and has been for several years, so we'll continue with that. The format of the recommendations will change somewhat. And essentially what we'll do is align the look and feel of the recommendations. We're adopting, I think, a best practice from each of CDR and PCODER. From CDR, we'll adopt really the greatest structure and consistency in terms of how recommendations are essentially stated and communicated, particularly the conditions associated with any recommendations. Whereas on the PCODER side, we'll build on their experience in really developing the part of the recommendation that addresses implementation issues that have been brought up by the drug plan. So we hope that the new aligned harmonized format will be stronger for both of these facts, but just be aware that the precise format of the recommendations could change. I don't think the contents will be dramatically different going forward, at least in terms of the alignment work. So we can move on. Draft recommendations. So we wanted to highlight this, but we believe important change, a notable change will be that we will be posting all draft recommendations publicly for stakeholder feedback. So this will be new and it'll apply across all of our drug reviews. But just to reemphasize, we will post for public comment all of the draft recommendations prior to them being finalized. It is being done right now, and it has been for some time at PCODER, but we will now expand this to CDR and the other reviews that we do. The main reason really is transparency and being able to receive comment from all the relevant stakeholders. We're looking at, in terms of timing, just so you're aware, posting to occur about 2 weeks after the committee meeting has concluded. And this, just to bring it back to the original slide on confidentiality and the fact that we are still having to retain a redaction process for potentially confidential information, means that we have to build this into our process, and this will cause a delay in essentially releasing the draft recommendations, which will be redacted. However, the drug programs and sponsors will continue to receive the unredacted or completely transparent draft recommendations. So we can move on. Reconsiderations. Just to note why we're making changes related to reconsiderations is there's quite a dramatic difference in the number of reviews or files that go to reconsiderations on the oncology side versus the non-oncology side. For CDR, only about 1 out of 5 submissions go through the reconsideration process, whereas on the PCODER side, the oncology side, it's almost the opposite, where in excess of 70% of the submissions are going back to the committee for reconsideration. Really, the result of a reconsideration is a delay to the issuing of the final recommendation. That's it in terms of the bottom line. In terms of time, so it is resource intensive, both for the submitter, the sponsor, as well as obviously for CADTH staff, as well as our support staff and the expert committees, our experts, etc. It is costly and resource intensive. And most importantly, as I pointed out, it does delay the issuance of a final recommendation, which in turn delays access. So we're proposing some changes to really try and avoid unnecessary delays and speed up the reconsideration process, and therefore become more efficient through these changes as well. So we can move to the next slide. Our proposal really revolves around structuring reconsiderations into different types based on their complexity. Most important to note, I think, would be what we're calling major revisions. These would be either a change to the recommendation category, so you can imagine a recommendation to not reimburse a product. If you wanted that to be changed to reimburse, that would be a change in the recommendation category. Or an important change to the population that is covered by the reimbursement, for instance, the conditions, potentially expanding that population beyond what the initial recommendation recommends. The two other categories would be minor revisions, which really are revisions that would not really substantially change the population that's covered by the reimbursement, and then really minor changes, for instance, corrections to data points or text, which we're going to refer to as editorial revisions. And we will essentially structure the process to be much more rapid in terms of dealing with things like editorial revisions, and reserve the more costly and time-intensive process for the major revisions, which we don't think will be as numerous as is currently the case. Important point to note is that we will reserve the major revision category for stakeholders that essentially are going to be key in essentially the decisions around reimbursement for that product. So that would be the sponsor who's submitted the file to us, and essentially it's their product, as well as the public payers who will be eventually responsible potentially for reimbursing that product. So they will be the ones that are able to essentially force the process down the more time-intensive and resource-intensive major revision pathway. That said, I think for all of these categories, the important point is the last one, which is that we will accept feedback from all stakeholders and any stakeholders. This feedback will be explicitly considered during the reconsideration process, whatever that process, whichever pathway it follows, including deliberation by the expert committees. Okay, we can move on. So a note about the provisional algorithm process. This really falls under the umbrella of implementation. Again, more details in the material that we provided for consultation. But just to highlight that as part of the updates to the implementation work that we've made to create an aligned process across all of our reviews, we have come up with essentially a new process to address the provincial algorithm questions that arise, particularly on the oncology side. So really the objectives, they're on the slide, but we tried to address some concerns raised particularly by industry with the original proposal that we had in place, and that was to enhance transparency, particularly for any manufacturers potentially affected by the process, and provide a mechanism for them to be included, as well as provide some greater clarity to sponsors in terms of what information we would find useful for our review purposes, and then finally introduce some efficiencies for ourselves. So I think the key point to emphasize is the latter 2 points on the slide, but really we've created an algorithm process now that will include any sponsors or manufacturers who may have products that are potentially impacted by any algorithms that are developed through CADTH. So the process that we're having proposed to put in place will essentially provide an opportunity for any affected manufacturers. First of all, we will they will be notified that this work is happening, but more importantly, they will be provided an opportunity to participate directly within that and provide input to us. So we can move on. The next point to point out on the provisional algorithm process is that we're adjusting the timing really to be more efficient. Without going into too much detail, essentially we were taking a process that had been developed to occur downstream of the CADTH review to now occur upstream and concurrent with our review, which really will be a major efficiency gain for us when you consider that if you do something downstream, there is a potential to end up doing a considerable amount of work for files that essentially will end up in a negative recommendation and will not be funded. So that work essentially is a waste of investment. So we've corrected the timing and adjusted the process to make sure that we only do this, downstream, if and when there is an appropriate trigger in the appropriate circumstances. So thereby avoiding us doing work upstream for reviews that eventually will not be proceeding for reimbursement. And the final point, if we can move on to the next slide, is just in terms of addressing the algorithm quality. We have recognized that some of the guidance perhaps was not optimal in terms of what information we were using and how we were using that. So we've moved towards, essentially we'll provide a template which makes it very clear and explicit what information would be useful to us. And we're asking that that is essentially a mandatory submission on your part, which will help both ourselves as well as yourselves in terms of being more efficient with these processes and more clear in terms of what information we are asking for and what information we're using during our review process. So we're hoping that will be well received too. So we can move on. I'd like to just highlight, getting close to the conclusion of my section, that there is a review, an additional consultation underway at the moment between Health Canada, NS, and ourselves about the aligned review process. So again, I know it's potentially confusing, but there is our proposal for CADTH on alignment of our internal review processes, but then there is the aligned review process, which is the joint effort between ourselves, NS, and Health Canada. So apologies, I know it is potentially confusing, but just to highlight what is in that consultation and why we've done it, we can go to the next slide, thanks. It goes back, this process for essentially being able to participate in an aligned review between ourselves, CADTH, NS, and Health Canada goes back to about 2 years now, the R2D2 initiative, where the idea was to try to eliminate unnecessary delays between the regulator's review and these new products being available through the public payer system. And this really led to the establishment of an initiative where companies, as you probably are familiar, can submit prior to NOC and participate in a process which sees kind of an aligned review occur in terms of the temporal timing of it between Health Canada and the HTA bodies, CADTH and NS. We did commit to doing a review of the process, which we have done. And I think one of the challenges that we've come across that we'd like to rectify, which is really kind of the key of the consultation, is the fact that the process has always been opt-in. It's a voluntary process, and the voluntary nature is essentially what has led to suboptimal uptake and therefore suboptimal benefits in terms of the potential for this process to eliminate delays to access. So this is essentially the core of what the the other consultation is about. So we can move to the next slide. So what we're seeking in terms of feedback, in terms of the other consultation, the joint consultation, is really proposal to move from an opt-in participation to mandatory participation. Now, mandatory participation doesn't mean that you are forced to participate. It means simply that if you would like to have your review done pre-NOC, then we're asking that you sign the information sharing part of the process. And that is essentially what we're talking about in terms of mandatory participation. It's the information sharing part of the process. You're free to continue with a standard review and not sign information sharing. It's absolutely at your discretion. But if you'd like to avail yourself of the advantages of the pre-NOC pathway, then we're proposing that it will be mandatory to sign the information sharing agreement. A couple of points to note: there are no changes in terms of the timing for the aligned review process. The details again are elsewhere. I'm not going to go into those. I did emphasize you're still free to participate in a standard review, absolutely at your discretion without signing the information sharing agreement. And just to let you know that consultations for this are also open until August 10th if you were planning to submit feedback. So we can move to the next slide. I believe this is my last slide. So just to cover next steps in terms of the alignment consultation, open until August 10th. You're welcome to contact any of our team directly, but the easiest is to, if you'd like any more details, simply send an email to requests@cadth.ca. We will be taking time to compile all the feedback that we get and go through all of it prior to implementing any of the changes we've discussed today. We're hoping that, considering that none of the changes are particularly controversial, that most of them are in fact going to be well received and favorable, and that nothing is new, we're hoping to be able to proceed quickly towards implementation, ideally targeting the fall of this year. And with that, I'll conclude my section and hand it over back to Brent.
Thanks, Trevor. Maybe just before Sarah starts her presentation, I would just ask that if people could ensure when they're submitting questions that they include the tab that is for all panelists and all attendees. We've received a number of questions that have come directly to the panelists, and we'll go through those at the end of this presentation, but just for future questions so that people are aware of the types of questions that are coming in. And so I'll pass it over now to Sarah, and she'll walk through some of the proposed changes that impact the patient groups.
Thank you, Brent. Next slide, please. So we very much welcome feedback from patient groups and from families. And as Trevor and Brent mentioned, to support groups, we ran a webinar 2 weeks ago, a sort of proposed changes 101. For those who are less familiar with our programs. And that recording is now on YouTube, so if you'd like to watch that, that's available. During the consultation, patient groups and families can contact our team. That's Julie, Tamara, Kathleen, or myself. If you prefer to give verbal feedback or if you want to share your thoughts via email. Within the survey that's posted, there are a lot of questions. You don't need to answer all of the questions. Respond to the prompts that matter to you. Next slide. With regards to patient input, we're proposing that kind of some of the good practices from PCODA and from CDR be applied to all of our drug reimbursement reviews. Groups will continue to have those 7 weeks to prepare input, and we're proposing it be directly uploaded to our website without needing to pre-register. For CDR, CADTH returns our summary of the patient input to the groups for them to confirm kind of accuracy. Let us know if that's something that is actually helpful, and if you'd like us to continue doing that and expand that. An important proposed change that Trevor mentioned is that patient groups who originally provided input can comment on the draft recommendations when they are shared on CADTH's website. There will be a 10-day period to be able to provide feedback. This is exactly what happens at the moment with PCODA, and now we're proposing that this be applied to all drug reviews. And also, if it's helpful, CADTH provides tailored thank you letters to the patient groups who provided input, identifying how their input was used in the reviews. So that's something we'd apply to all reviews as well. Next slide. So Trevor spoke on the details of how we propose reports are prepared, what happens with the feedback on the draft recommendation, and the implementation support that CADTH can offer for the drug plans following our reviews. I do encourage you to look at the consultation document, to look at sections 6, 7, 8, and 11, because there is more detail in that. As proposed, patients or patient groups are not directly involved in the clinical panels, in the implementation panels, but our expert committees will continue to have a patient or a public member, and the patient input will continue to be used in our reports, in the recommendations, the deliberations by the committee, and now will also be used in terms of that implementation phase. So we do welcome your thoughts, especially any new approaches or ideas that you have on how we can best balance the sort of efficiency, the speed, the rigor of our reviews, as well as equity and transparency to help us build a strong program for all Canadians. Thank you. Next slide, and pass back to Brent.
Thanks, Sarah. And Nicole will talk to us about the deliberative processes and the framework pieces that we're undertaking.
Thank you very much, Brent. Next slide, please. Thanks very much. We wanted to think about the deliberative process and framework along with the alignment work, and are there best practices around our expert panel reviews? And so we have 2 drug panels, the oncology, the non-oncology, but we also have a devices and clinical interventions panel. All 3 expert committees have slightly different ways of approaching a question and a submission. And so here's our opportunity to look at links or harmonization activities. So what we thought we would do is identify opportunities for harmonizing these expert panel reviews and committee processes and frameworks where possible, and then also provide some guidance on potential enhancements to CADTH's expert committees with respect to the deliberative processes and frameworks. So we'll define that in the next slide, please. So when we talk about a deliberative process, really this is the mechanism and environment with which the deliberative dialogue takes place. So here we have committee members, the discussion that happens within the process, the order, who presents when, what kind of information do they present, and decision making as well, and what kind of data or tools are used. When we talk about the framework, these are the criteria, the attributes, the sub-criteria, and the definitions that are used in the dialogue at the committee member and at the recommendations. So what kind of attributes are included? Are we talking about clinical efficacy, safety? Are we talking about economics? Are we talking about other things? For example, could it be legal or social or other factors that are included in the dialogue when making a decision? Next slide, please. So we have a number of pieces of work today, which is all culminating into some consultation, which Trevor alluded to, but let's talk about the work to date, please. Next slide, please. So we've been working with a group called the Center for Innovation in Regulatory Science, and they actually have a process by which they review the quality of deliberations and the deliberation committees. So not only looking at the internal scope of the work, but also the external scope of the work. We've gone through and used this quality assessment tool with all 3 committees at CADTH. And we've just received the results back, so we're just in the process of reviewing the results. We had almost 30 plus respondents across these 3 committees, and those kinds of questions within the quality framework would have been anything from transparency to did you actually think your decision or your opinion made an impact on the decision itself. And so preliminary interpretation, we've seen it by committee. We're just now linking it all together to see if there are any trends in terms of work or in terms of the information provided by the 3 committees. And they would look at things like bias and transparency and communication. So we're hoping to disseminate those findings in the near future. Next slide, please. Other work is that we're part of the Health Technology Assessment International group and their Global Policy Forum, which brings together both health technology agencies and also industry. And there was a meeting in February of 2020 where we talked about the deliberative process and deliberative frameworks in general. And from a deliberative process point of view, there were 3 general final principles that were discussed at this policy forum, which included transparency. So how are we, what kinds of value will be deliberated on, and what were the reasons for the decision making? The next was inclusivity. Do we have appropriate representation on committees? Can these individuals on the committees make the decisions? And are we missing any information? And impartiality. So all members understand their roles, their conflict, their biases are very clear, and they understand the purpose of the deliberative process as well, and along with the deliberative framework. And so these were the 3 final principles that were decided on at an international level in terms of looking at deliberative processes in general. And other ones were reviewability, consistency, responsibility, and accountability. And some of that work will actually be considered then in our alignment work with respect to transparency and consistency and reasonableness. Next slide, please. So just a couple of points that were discussed at this international meeting. Consistency was not to be confused with sameness, but rather consistency of application of the process. So if we look at across a number of committees, you know, are they actually presenting the data in the same order? Are people voting in the same manner? All of those kinds of things, can we start to streamline those questions and the processes? And then thinking about the patient and the public perspectives, how do we include both? Do we include one or the other? Is there a social perspective that we need to consider as well? And we're starting to look at best practices across the different health technology assessment organizations as well. And then the industry members who were at this global policy forum indicated a stronger involvement in the evidence generation. They talked a lot about real world evidence. And actually that's one of the topics for a future meeting at the global policy forum in terms of how do we incorporate some of that. From a payer perspective, having transparency and inclusivity in terms of the information that is deliberated on, the information that is shared, and then who is part of that deliberation process was also key to some of the recommendations that were provided here. Next slide, please. As mentioned already, we're conducting an environmental scan. Obviously, deliberation is very complex and it differs by health technology agency and involves often value judgments. There are different tools, different metrics, and different ways to actually think about it. And then multiple stakeholders are included in all of these and who should be at that decision-making table. And there's really a need for, you know, the transparency and the legitimacy and also so that we can actually align or harmonize some of the process. So we're trying to, CADTH recommendation committees are often being referred to as using best practice, but there's always room for improvement. And this is an opportunity, along with the alignment, to look at how we do our work. And then there's a recently evidence-informed deliberative process, which currently or closely reflects our current practice. And so we're working with that as well. And then we'll have also best practices by each of the organizations. Next slide, please. So these are all the steps, as mentioned, the SEERS review, the Health Technology Assessment International Global Policy Forum. We're working with each of the committees, the chairs, the staff. It's an engaged group of individuals who are also providing lots of content for us. We're monitoring what other health technology agencies are doing across the globe, and then looking, as mentioned already, at best practices. Next slide, please. So we're just at it's all happening exactly at the same time as COVID, but we're finalizing our internal reviews. We're also trying to make some final recommendations, which will consist of acute, medium, and long-term recommendations. And then that will also go out for external consultation, which we hope will be the fall of 2020. That's it. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Nicole. And I'll pass it on to Michelle, who will talk a little bit about the ethics within our review programs.
Thanks very much, Brent. Next slide. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to be part of this webinar and share a little bit about the ethics contribution to cell and gene therapies at CADTH. I just have this one slide before we open it up for questions. So I think it was back in beginning of 2020 when we first notified that we had revised our cell and gene therapy review process. We leveraged the learning from the first 2 cell and gene therapy projects and combined the strengths that we had in our medical device portfolio with the strengths that we had in our pharmaceutical review portfolio, and to come up with this revised process. One of the elements of the revised process is to include an ethics component as part of the cell and gene therapies reviews. So I'll tell you a little bit about this report. The report will describe any relevant ethical considerations that were raised explicitly in the literature related to the therapy that's under review. The review will be prepared in accordance with the template, and the sponsor will have an opportunity to review the report. And I think it's important to note that this report represents really a structured input to support deliberation by the committees. And speaking about those committees, one important and I think exciting and progressive development is that both drug expert review committees will soon each have a dedicated seat for an ethicist. We weren't able to follow our standard nominations process due to the pandemic, so we undertook a targeted recruitment for an ethicist, and working with the chairs, we've identified 2 successful candidates, and we anticipate soon making the appointments. And so on that note, I'd just like to thank the chairs as well as Trevor and Brent for their support in adding this position to the committees. I know it's not easy to add another seat to that table. However, I do believe it's an important perspective and important that it's part of all expert committees at CADTH. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. We have about 25 minutes for questions, and as a reminder, you can submit your questions through the chat function in Zoom. Our preference is for you to send it out to all panelists and attendees so that people are aware. There's been a couple of buckets of information or questions that have come in. One is around transparency, others is around CMAs and the criteria for cost minimization analyses. So we'll talk about those in a little bit more detail. With respect to the transparency piece, there is some detailed information in one of the appendices to the consultation that will provide information for you. We haven't specifically looked at which process is the best, CDR versus PCODER, but I think that we have leveraged from both programs as much as possible in our experience with manufacturers and how redactions are applied. I think we have said in multiple public venues that our ideal scenario is to have no redactions, but based on the feedback that we had received from companies, we have decided to make a few adjustments to that position. And we are identifying in that appendix when information would be considered confidential and therefore redacted, and when it would not be considered confidential. There is a question around time-limited redactions. As you're aware, one of the key things that we are trying to do is be more efficient within our reviews. Time-limited redactions means that we have to do the work twice. And we also know, based on published literature and articles, that many of the times when companies indicate that information is to be published, it's not followed through. And in about 50% of the cases, that information is never actually published. So the redaction really happened for no reason at all. If for whatever reason a company can prove that the publication of that information would prevent evidence from, prevent a future publication, that's something that we may consider. But we would ask that if there's any sort of approaches you would like us to consider, to include that in the feedback portion of this consultation. As far as Health Canada's confidential business information, it's very limited as to what they will not be considering as non-confidential. It's really only two scenarios. One is related to specific tests that were designed to help support the clinical trials or administration of a product. The other is around evidence that is available within Health Canada, but is not related to the indication in which the drug was approved. In both of these cases, I think it's highly unlikely we would ever even want that information, and we certainly not want, we don't want data on other indications that are not under review. The testing, we would probably reference it, but we would not provide any specific details such that we would be providing confidential business information in our recommendations. And so we have tried to find a balance between what we heard in the initial feedback from companies and what our desired position is with respect to transparency. We did look at what other HTA organizations are doing, and we do think that we have reached an appropriate balance, and taking into consideration the feedback that we received from manufacturers. There was also some discussion around, maybe before I do that, Trevor, is there anything that you want to add to that particular piece? Still on mute.
Sorry, all that to say no, Brent. Thanks.
I think one of the key things that there were a few questions about is the fact that the reviews will be provided to the manufacturer ahead of it going into our committee. So we think that that is an increased level of transparency that CADTH is providing to the sponsors as part of our review. We are looking at other ways to be more transparent and adopting the approach that PCODER does with respect to allowing stakeholders to comment on our recommendations, increases the level of transparency as well. There is also a question around open meetings, and we have not made a specific decision around whether or not we will be opening up our discussions or committees for public stakeholders to attend. I think based on the experiences of other HTA bodies, there's been sort of positives and negatives associated with that. So all that to say is I think this is still a work in progress. We haven't said we won't go in this direction, but maybe what we would be looking at is other options that are available to increase our transparency. At recognizing that we're asking manufacturers to be more transparent with their data as well. There was a bit of a discussion around or questions related to clinicians and whether or not they can still provide their data through the patient submission process. We would really like to keep these processes separate from one another as much as possible. We do realize that some patient groups rely on their medical advisors to help provide information in through their responses, and certainly we would be supportive of that approach. However, if it's a specific clinician submission, we would request that they go through the clinician submission feedback process or commentaries. This makes sure that the information that our committee is reviewing, that they understand what the point of reference is with respect to what is being communicated in their initial information, as well as understanding when it's a group of physicians, is this a particular standard of practice as opposed to individual physicians where the feed or the information they're providing to the review might be more specific to that individual's place of practice. And so they're not sure how to apply that more broadly when they're looking at all of the data. So that is why we would encourage, and it's the same thing with patient groups as well, to provide feedback through a broader group, being engaged in tumor groups, being engaged in their associations, and hoping to provide that feedback through those vehicles as much as possible. I don't know, Sarah, is there anything that you want to add to that particular piece?
No, nothing more to add there.
Okay. Thanks, Sarah. And then maybe I'll have Karen talk a little bit about cost minimization analyses. There's been a lot of questions around, is there going to be criteria? Are we going to communicate anything around the CMAs versus cost utility analysis? And so maybe, Karen, I'll pass it over to you. And if there's some additional information you can provide, that would be great.
Great. Great. Thank you, Brent. I'm not sure if, yeah. Thanks, Brent. And thank you for the comments regarding the cost minimization analyses. The intention was to have this up for consultation and get some feedback. So the questions that have been posed are very helpful. The intent is that that sponsors would meet all three criteria that are currently listed in 5.3.2. The feedback from you is going to be very helpful for us to actually formalize what could be the requirements regarding cost minimization analyses. And so we do look forward to receive any feedback that you do have. And once we do finalize that, that would be fully communicated. And I guess the point to make regarding the cost minimization analysis is you are always eligible to submit, and we do accept cost utility analyses. And so if there's any question regarding what to submit, we do recommend that you do follow the recommended approach and submit a cost utility analysis. We are looking for very specific situations whereby there could be efficiencies gained by submitting a cost minimization analysis based on what we've heard from various stakeholders. And so that's why they're quite tight. There was a question regarding whether or not this is aligned with PMPRB's guidelines. And generally speaking, the proposed criteria that we have stipulated would not meet necessarily their criteria for category 1 drugs. And so that's what we would like to kind of keep this quite contained for now, looking at very specific drugs that would meet the CMA criteria.
Thanks, Karen. There's also been a few questions around posting feedback received by stakeholders, whether or not we will be putting that on our website. Trevor, do you want to maybe speak in general to how we would be dealing with the feedback we receive from stakeholders?
Yeah, that's not strictly part of this consultation, but I think our intent, if we're able to, would be to in fact share all the feedback publicly. So we would actually plan, if not during the immediate launch of this aligned process, then very soon thereafter to build public sharing of that feedback into the processes.
Yeah, thanks, Trevor. Is there any other question, Trevor, that you want to specifically focus on?
Well, it's challenging keeping up with all the questions, but so I guess what you haven't addressed and what Karen hasn't addressed, there are some questions that I think really, I think are best addressed by referring to the consultation documents. Some that I could maybe try and just address quickly. So a question from Michael, would CADTH staff be making final determination of what is redactable? The answer is yes. Will clinicians still be able to self-organize? This is from AJ, self-organize to provide input through a patient group. Well, the idea would be that they can organize but provide input through the clinician input process now, not through the patient input process. And we're in fact hoping to distinguish between the two. So scientific advisory boards, for instance, of clinicians that are associated with patient groups should be submitting through as a clinician group. From Michael about did we consider other transparency measures requested by industry, such as disclosure of the initial draft review reports, responses to manufacturers, feedback, etc.? Well, I think I covered that, and it's in the documentation that, in fact, yes, we have been able to implement most of those suggestions. So I think the short answer is yes. From Bonnie, the discretionary discussions or the ad hoc discussions I mentioned, Bonnie, are not new, but essentially they're essentially anything that cannot be accommodated through our normal channels of discussion. So for instance, if you're considering a reconsideration, there is a provision there to have a telephone call, a teleconference with us to discuss that. And there are various other channels as well. But if something is needed to be addressed for that review to proceed and we cannot achieve that through regular communication and then ideally email, then that's when we would see a need for those ad hoc calls. So really, it's really not simply trying to accommodate every request we get for a call. Because of our limited resources, it really would be usually initiated by ourselves. A couple other questions I saw that are we could address quickly. I think the CMA question has been addressed. Just please refer to the documentations about the criteria, just to reemphasize though that a number of people have misinterpreted that as being a requirement. It won't be a requirement. It's at your discretion whether to do that or a CUA. Someone has unmuted themselves, by the way, if you were just laughing. The question from Yen about the Health Canada sharing. So really refer to that proposal, please. But just briefly, yes, the idea is that you would provide that signed letter to Health Canada upon initiation of the review, the submission to Health Canada. So it's done way up front of any of the HTA review processes even starting, but that would have to be in place at the outset, and you file it with Health Canada. Again, that information is all in the proposal. And then I think one other question perhaps I could try and address is the triggers for the algorithm work. So again, yeah, that would be triggered by the public payers. There are no black and white criteria. Really, our intent is to make available a process that would address any implementation issues that the plans would like to have addressed. If they want those addressed, we will have a process to address those. It's up to them to determine which issues they would like addressed and what criteria might be associated with that. So I don't think we can provide too much more detail on that particular point. I think that's it, Brent. I don't know if any other questions have come in.
Thanks, Trevor. I think, again, there's a number of questions coming up around the clinician group input. And maybe just to reemphasize a couple of points. First off, we're not saying that an individual physician can't provide input. The challenge, though, for our committee is to understand whether or not this is reflective of practice across Canada, or if this is specific to an individual's place of practice. And therefore, there could be some conflict between what we receive from a broader association or a tumor group within a jurisdiction compared to the individual clinician's input. And so that is why we encourage individuals to work with their associations or to work with their agencies and tumor groups within those agencies to make sure that they are connecting between the two. There have been situations in the past where patient groups have provided the exact same feedback as their medical advisory committee has provided. That hasn't really added a lot to our particular reviews, but it certainly is really, I guess, more process related. We're duplicating submission information or input information, and it doesn't add a whole lot of value at the end of the day to our review. So I would just strongly encourage that clinicians work with other clinicians. If there's a small group that wants to come together to provide some feedback, they're certainly able to do so. But I think if they really want to strengthen the input, it's best to work with their own associations and disease site groups when providing feedback. I think it's also important to note, as Trevor mentioned, we do have individual clinicians who are on our reviews as well. So we do ask a lot of questions around place in therapy, what the current standard of practice is, how this drug contributes to the current standard of practice, what it would mean if it was to be funded from a physician choice perspective, how would it fit within the entire group of drugs that are used to treat a particular condition. So that feedback does come in through that process as well. And at a minimum, that would include one practicing physician within that area, but often includes 2 to 3 clinicians as well. Why is the clinician term? Well, we are looking at conflict of interest that will look at providing more details on clinicians who are consulted in our process. That is something that we will be communicating at a different point in time and getting some feedback on the conflicts of interest process. And there was a final question about whether we would be putting together a Q&A with respect to the questions that are raised. So yes, at the end of the consultation, we'll be summarizing the feedback that we've received along with a response. And that would be publicly available to stakeholders prior to us moving forward with implementation. I think that covers things for the most part. There is a question around the algorithm. Trevor, do you want to speak to that piece?
So there was a question on how CADTH would reconcile differences in input from a variety of stakeholders for the algorithm work. And I think essentially we follow the same approach that we do. We do get stakeholder feedback for the other components of our review that are not necessarily in alignment. Essentially, in the case of the algorithms, we will make sure that they're aware of and that all that feedback is made available to them. And ultimately, it's their job and it'll be their responsibility to weigh all the feedback and any discrepant opinions in whatever advice they might be providing.
Thanks, Trevor. So just recognizing the time, I think that that's all the time we'll have today for questions. So a big thank you to everybody who presented today, and also to all of you who have joined this webinar. As mentioned earlier, the webinar will be recorded and it will be posted on CADTH's YouTube channel early next week, and your comments will be included as stakeholder feedback. A short survey will open when you leave the webinar, so please take a moment to let us know if this webinar was helpful and if there are other things we can do to make the consultation process more accessible going forward. Final reminder, I would like to remind you that CADTH's COVID-19 webinar series resumes in August with talks on developing a COVID-19 vaccine and blood plasma therapies for COVID-19. So please keep an eye out for on CADTH's website for details, and hopefully we'll see you at these events as well. So again, thank you very much for attending.